The 16th of April, 1918, dawned cold and gray over the Western Front. The kind of morning when death whispered through the clouds and men flying wooden crates wrapped in canvas played God among the mist. Lieutenant Douglas Campbell of the 94th Aero Squadron climbed into his Nieuport 28, his breath forming ghosts in the frigid air, unaware that within hours he would face one of Germany's most decorated pilots in a duel that would forever bind their fates together. Campbell was America's first official ace, distinction earned through brutal encounters above the scarred earth of France. At 23, the Harvard-educated pilot from Mount Clemens, Michigan, possessed the steady nerves and sharp instincts that separated survivors from casualties in the unforgiving arena of aerial combat. His squadron, the famous Hatten-Thuring outfit, had only recently begun operations, yet already their Nieuports bore the scars of desperate engagements against seasoned German pilots who had been perfecting the art of killing from the skies since 1914. That morning's patrol orders were simple: intercept enemy aircraft attempting reconnaissance over Allied lines near Toul. Intelligence reports suggested increased German air activity, and American commanders were desperate to prove their fledgling air service could match the legendary Jastas of the Imperial German Air Service. Campbell and his wingman, Lieutenant Alan Winslow, took off just after dawn, their engines sputtering against the cold before finding their rhythm. The sky above northeastern France was empty at first, nothing but gray emptiness, stretching toward the horizon. Campbell scanned the clouds methodically, knowing that complacency killed more pilots than enemy bullets. German fighters favored attacking from the sun, diving from altitude with the blinding light at their backs, Spando machine guns chattering death before their victims even knew they were there. Then he saw them, two German aircraft, Pafalts, D-3 fighters, their distinctive crosses stark against the pale fuselage. Campbell's heart hammered as he signaled Winslow and began his approach. What he didn't know was that one of those pilots was Lieutenant Paul Boehmer, a German ace credited with 43 victories, a hunter whose name struck fear into Allied airmen across the front. According to accounts preserved in the National Museum of the United States Air Force Archives, what followed was a textbook example of aerial combat in the Great War. Campbell positioned his Nieuport above and behind the German formation, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The key to survival in dogfighting was patience married to aggression. Knowing when to wait and when to commit everything to the attack, Boehmer spotted the Americans first. Years of combat had given him predatory instincts that bordered on supernatural. He broke formation immediately, climbing sharply to meet Campbell's challenge while his wingmen engaged Winslow. The two aircraft spiraled upward in a deadly dance, each pilot fighting for the altitude advantage that would mean the difference between living and dying. Campbell's Nieuport was nimble, but Boehmer's Pfalz was faster in a dive. They circled each other like medieval knights, machine guns spitting brief bursts whenever an opportunity presented itself. Campbell could see the German pilot's head turning, calculating angles and speeds, looking for the fatal mistake that would end the fight. Spent shell casings tumbled through the air, glinting in the weak morning light. The smell of castor oil from the rotary engines mixed with cordite smoke, creating the distinctive perfume of aerial combat. Then Boehmer made his move, a sudden half-roll and dive that should have positioned him perfectly on Campbell's tail. But the American had anticipated it, having studied reports of German tactics for months before arriving in France. Campbell pulled his Nieuport into a violent climbing turn that strained the wooden airframe to its limits, the wings groaning under the stress. For 3 desperate minutes, the two aircraft twisted through the sky in a deadly ballet that tested the limits of both machines and men. Campbell's hands were cramped around the control stick, his body thrown against the safety harness as he hauled the Nieuport through impossible maneuvers. Every movement had to be precise. One mistake would give Boehmer the opening he needed to pour machine gun fire into Campbell's vulnerable aircraft. The German ace was relentless, his faults seemingly everywhere at once. Campbell caught glimpses of the black-crossed fighter through his turns, sometimes above, sometimes to the side, always dangerous. Boehmer was trying to bait him into a mistake, using feints and false attacks to make Campbell waste his energy and ammunition. It was the strategy of a veteran pilot who had survived 3 years of combat, through superior tactics rather than reckless bravery. But Campbell had been trained by the French before America entered the war, and he had learned from the best. He kept his turns tight, his speed high, and his attacks disciplined. He fired only when he had a clear shot, conserving ammunition for the moment that mattered. The Vickers machine guns mounted on his Nieuport were reliable. They jammed easily, if fired in long bursts, and a jammed gun meant certain death. The opportunity came suddenly, as they often did in aerial combat. Boehmer attempted an Immelman turn, a classic maneuver designed to reverse direction while maintaining altitude. But perhaps he was tired, or perhaps his engine faltered for just a split second, whatever the reason. His faults hung in the air for a crucial moment, presenting its vulnerable belly to Campbell's guns. The American pilot didn't hesitate, squeezed the trigger, and felt his Nieuport shudder as the Vickers roared to life. Tracers arced across the sky, bright streaks of deadly phosphorus connecting his aircraft to Boehmer's. Campbell saw fabric tear, saw pieces of the Piletz's fuselage fly away in the slipstream. He fired again, a shorter burst aimed at the engine cowling, and was rewarded with a sudden gout of black smoke. Boehmer's aircraft lurched violently, its engine coughing and sputtering. The German pilot fought to control his stricken fighter, but the damage was catastrophic. The Pfalz began to spin, trailing smoke and debris as it plummeted toward the earth below. Campbell circled above, watching to confirm the kill, his emotions a confused mixture of triumph and horror. He had just defeated one of Germany's finest pilots, but he had also sent a man plunging toward a possible death. The Pfalz crashed in a field near the village of Gengo, roughly 2 miles behind Allied lines. Campbell marked the location carefully, noting landmarks that would help him find the crash site later. He saw figures running toward the wreckage of American soldiers from the nearby trenches, rushing to capture or aid the downed pilot. Then Campbell turned his Nieuport toward home, his fuel running low and his hands trembling with adrenaline. Back at the aerodrome, Campbell's victory was celebrated with the usual mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. Winslow had survived his encounter with Boehmer's wingman, though his Nieuport was riddled with bullet holes. The squadron's commanding officer, Major John Huffer, congratulated Campbell on downing what appeared to be a seasoned German pilot based on the aggressive tactics employed during the fight. Intelligence officers would visit the crash site to identify the pilot and assess the aircraft. But Campbell found he couldn't shake the image of the smoking Pfalz spinning toward the ground. Unlike many pilots who viewed their enemies as faceless opponents, Campbell had always maintained a complicated respect for the German airmen. They were professionals doing their duty, just as he was doing his. The romantic notion of chivalrous knights of the air wasn't entirely propaganda. There was a genuine code among fighter pilots that transcended national boundaries. The following day, April 17th, Campbell received startling news from intelligence. The pilot he had shot down was Paul Boehmer, one of Germany's most decorated aces. More remarkably, Boehmer had survived the crash, though he was gravely injured. He had been pulled from the wreckage by American infantrymen and transported to a field hospital near Toul. Surgeons were fighting to save his life. Campbell was shocked by the revelation. Shooting down an enemy aircraft was one thing. Learning that you had nearly killed a man whose reputation was known throughout both air services was quite another. That evening, unable to sleep, Campbell made a decision that would have been unthinkable in any other branch of the military. He would visit Boehmer in the hospital. The American Field Hospital at Toul occupied a converted chateau that had seen better days, its elegant facades marred by sandbags and camouflage netting. Campbell arrived on the morning of April 18th wearing his dress uniform and carrying a sense of trepidation that had nothing to do with fear. He had faced death in the air without flinching. The prospect of meeting the man he had nearly killed stirred emotions he couldn't quite name. The hospital staff were initially skeptical of his request. Visiting wounded enemy prisoners was unusual, potentially dangerous, and certainly irregular. But Campbell's status as America's first ace carried weight, and after consulting with the hospital's commanding officer, Major Thomas Andrews, he was granted permission for a brief visit. Andrews warned him that Boehmer's condition was serious. He had suffered a severe head injury, broken ribs, and internal bleeding from the crash. A nurse led Campbell through corridors that reeked of antiseptic and suffering, past wards filled with wounded men from both sides of the conflict. The chateau's grand ballroom had been converted into a recovery ward, its crystal chandeliers now hanging above rows of iron beds occupied by soldiers missing limbs, bearing terrible burns, or simply staring at the ceiling with eyes that had seen too much. War stripped away all pretense of glory in places like this. Baumer was in a private room, a small servant's quarter that offered privacy befitting his rank and status as a high-value prisoner. Two military policemen stood guard outside, their rifles at port arms. They stepped aside as Campbell approached, their faces carefully neutral. Inside, the room was sparse but clean, containing little more than a bed, a small table, and a single window that looked out over the hospital's courtyard. The German pilot lay motionless beneath white sheets, his head wrapped in bandages that covered one eye completely. His face was pale, almost gray, with the waxen quality that Campbell had learned to associate with men hovering between life and death. Da-da-da-da! An intravenous drip fed into his arm, and his breathing was shallow and labored. For a moment, Campbell wondered if Baumer was even conscious. Then the visible eye opened, dark and alert despite the injuries. Baumer turned his head slightly, studying his visitor with an intensity that transcended language barriers. Campbell saw intelligence in that gaze, and pain. And something else, perhaps curiosity about why an enemy pilot would come to see him in such circumstances. Lieutenant Baumer, Campbell began, his German halting but serviceable. He had studied the language at Harvard, never imagining he would use it to speak with a man he had tried to kill. I am Lieutenant Douglas Campbell, 94th Aero Squadron. I was the pilot who engaged you yesterday. A ghost of a smile crossed Baumer's lips. When he spoke, his voice was weak but clear, his English surprisingly good, better than Campbell's German. The Neoport pilot. I thought it might be you. Your tactics were excellent, French-trained. Campbell nodded, pulling a chair close to the bed and sitting down. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on him. Two men who had been trying to kill each other less than 48 hours ago, now having a civil conversation about combat tactics, yet it felt strangely natural, as if the shared experience of aerial combat created a bond that superseded nationality. I trained at Avard with the French before America entered the war, Campbell explained. I learned from some of the best Nungesser, Gnamer's old instructors. They taught me that surviving is more important than scoring victories. Baumer's eye gleamed with what might have been approval. Wise philosophy. Too many young pilots think they are immortal. I have trained 42 pilots in my career, perhaps 15 are still alive. The others believed in glory more than survival. He paused, wincing as pain lanced through his broken ribs. You flew well, Lieutenant. Under different circumstances, I would have been honored to have you as a wingman. The conversation that followed would later be documented in Campbell's personal journals, now housed at the Smithsonian Institution. The two pilots talked for nearly an hour, discussing tactics, aircraft capabilities, mutual acquaintances in the international aviation community, and the strange fraternity of men who fought in the sky. Baumer spoke of the early days of the war, when aerial combat was improvised and chaotic. Before the development of synchronized machine guns and proper fighter tactics, he described dueling with British aces over the Somme, his voice growing distant as he remembered fallen friends and worthy opponents. Campbell listened, fascinated by this glimpse into the German side of the air war, a perspective rarely shared across enemy lines. Baumer asked about American aircraft and training methods, genuinely curious about the new force entering the conflict. Your country is bringing fresh energy to an exhausted war, Baumer observed, his voice growing weaker. We have been fighting for nearly 4 years. My squadron has lost so many good men. When I saw your Neoport yesterday, I thought perhaps this would be my last fight. I was not wrong, though perhaps not in the way I expected. As Campbell sat beside Baumer's bed, the morning light filtering through the room's single window cast long shadows across the floor, marking time's passage in ways that neither pilot had measured when they were locked in aerial combat. The German aces' conditions seemed to stabilize somewhat as they talked, as if the conversation itself provided a kind of medicine that the doctors couldn't prescribe. Baumer asked about Campbell's background, his path to becoming a pilot, and Campbell found himself speaking more openly than he had in months. He described his comfortable upbringing in Michigan, his years at Harvard studying architecture, a career that now seemed impossibly distant from the reality of war. He explained how the romance of aviation had drawn him to France in 1917, before America's entry into the conflict. He had trained with French pilots who treated flying as both an art and a science. Architecture to aviation, Baumer mused, a slight smile crossing his damaged face. Perhaps they are not so different. Both require understanding three-dimensional space, structural limits, the relationship between form and function. I studied mechanical engineering before the war. I thought I would design automobiles. Instead, I learned to destroy flying machines. The irony wasn't lost on either man. Campbell had read about the pre-war enthusiasm for aviation. How pilots from all nations had gathered at air shows and competitions, sharing knowledge and celebrating human achievement. Now those same men were hunting each other across the skies of Europe, turning the miracle of flight into an instrument of death. The war had perverted something beautiful, transforming dreamers into killers. A nurse entered briefly to check Bomber's vital signs and adjust his intravenous drip. She gave Campbell a disapproving look. Visiting enemy prisoners was still highly irregular, but said nothing. After she left, Bomber gestured weakly toward the window. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what do you see when you look at the sky now? Do you still see beauty, or only danger?" Campbell considered the question carefully. It cut to the heart of something he had been wrestling with since his first kill. The fundamental transformation that combat imposed on a pilot's perception. "Both," he finally answered. "The sky at dawn is still magnificent, the way light breaks through clouds, the sense of freedom when you're above the earth. But now there's always an edge to it, a awareness that beauty and death occupy the same space. Every cloud could hide an enemy. Every moment of peace could explode into violence." Bomer nodded slowly, understanding in his visible eye. "Yes, exactly yes. I remember my first flight before the war, in a small Taube monoplane. I felt like a god, like I had transcended human limitations. Now I am an angel of death, and the sky has become my battlefield." He paused, breathing carefully around his broken ribs. "Tell me something, Lieutenant. When you shot me down, did you feel triumph or regret?" The question hung in the air between them, honest and challenging. Campbell had been trained to celebrate victories, to view each enemy aircraft destroyed as a contribution to winning the war. But sitting beside the man he had nearly killed, seeing him as a human being rather than a target, the answer became more complicated. "Both," Campbell admitted again. "In the moment, there was relief I had survived. I had won the fight. But afterward, watching your aircraft fall, I felt something else. Not quite regret, but a recognition that I had possibly ended a man's life. A man I didn't know, who had done nothing to me personally, but who happened to be on the other side of a war neither of us started." Bomer absorbed this, his eye closing for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You were honest. That is rare. Most pilots I have known, on both sides, they build walls around such thoughts. They must to continue fighting. But the walls have costs. I have seen pilots become machines, efficient killers who have forgotten they are human. Others break under the weight of what they have done." The German pilot went on to describe the psychological toll of sustained aerial combat, something rarely discussed openly in either air service. He spoke of pilots who developed tremors, who couldn't sleep without nightmares, who grew reckless because they no longer cared whether they lived or died. The casualty lists published in newspapers didn't capture these invisible wounds, the slow erosion of the soul that combat imposed on those who survived long enough to feel it. "I have 43 victories," Bomer continued, his voice growing stronger despite his obvious exhaustion. 43 times I have destroyed an enemy aircraft. How many of those pilots died, I do not know. Perhaps 20, perhaps 30. They haunt me, Lieutenant. I see their faces in my dreams, or rather, I imagine their faces, since most times I never saw them clearly. Just silhouettes in cockpits. Men whose names I will never know, whose families will never know exactly how they died. Campbell felt a chill run through him. Bomer was articulating thoughts that had haunted his own quiet moments, fears he had barely acknowledged to himself. The German ace had survived 3 years of combat, had become one of the most successful pilots in the Imperial German Air Service. And yet the cost was written plainly on his face, not just in the physical wounds from the crash, but in the deeper scars that no surgeon could treat. "Do you regret becoming a pilot?" Campbell asked quietly. He had to know, needed to understand what awaited him if he survived the war, if he continued adding to his own tally of victories. Bomer considered the question for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. "No," he finally said. "Despite everything, no. I am good at it. Perhaps that sounds arrogant, but it is true. I have skills that can protect my comrades, that can contribute to my country's cause. But I regret what the war has made of me, what it makes of all of us. Start as men and become weapons, and I wonder if we can ever truly become men again." The clock on the wall marked the passage of their conversation into its second hour. Campbell knew he should leave. Bomar needed rest, and the hospital staff were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the extended visit. But there was something profound happening in this small room, connection forming between two warriors that transcended the artificial boundaries of war. Before Campbell could rise to leave, Bomar spoke again. "Lieutenant Campbell, there is something I must tell you. Something important about what happened during our fight." The German pilot's voice had taken on a tone of urgency. "Despite his obvious fatigue, I want you to know that I made mistakes in our engagement. My judgment was compromised. Should not have been flying that morning." Campbell leaned forward, intrigued and confused. In their aerial duel, Bomar had seemed formidable, his tactics sophisticated and aggressive. What mistakes could he be referring to? Bomar's visible eye fixed on Campbell with disturbing intensity. "I had been flying combat missions for 11 consecutive days. My squadron commander wanted me to rest, but I refused. I was close to reaching 50 victories, close to joining the ranks of Germany's greatest aces. Pride drove me, Lieutenant. Foolish, deadly pride." He paused, his breathing labored. "When I saw your Neoport, I should have been cautious. You had altitude advantage, and my wingman was inexperienced, but I engaged anyway, believing my skill would compensate for poor tactical position." The admission was stunning in its honesty. Campbell had studied enough aerial combat reports to recognize that fatigue was one of the great silent killers of fighter pilots. Reflexes slowed, judgment faltered. The mistakes that would have been unthinkable when fresh became fatal after too many consecutive days of combat. The German air service, like all the combatant nations, struggled with balancing the need for experienced pilots in the air against the necessity of rest and recovery. "During our fight," Bomar continued, his voice growing weaker, "there was a moment when I could have disengaged. When you executed that climbing turn after my dive, I should have recognized it as a trap. A rested pilot would have seen it. But I was tired and angry at myself for making a mistake, and I pressed the attack instead of breaking off. That is when you got your shot." Campbell sat back, processing this information. Part of him wanted to dismiss it, to believe that his victory had been purely the result of superior skill and tactics. But Bomar's words rang true, and they contained an important lesson. In aerial combat, conditions mattered as much as capability. The best pilot in the world, fighting while exhausted, could be defeated by a competent opponent at full alertness. "Why are you telling me this?" Campbell asked. "You could have let me believe I defeated you through skill alone." A genuine smile crossed Bomar's face, though it was tinged with pain. "Because you came here, Lieutenant? Because you showed respect, curiosity, humanity? These are qualities worth cultivating, worth protecting from the brutality of war. I tell you this so you will learn from my mistake. When you are tired, when your judgment is compromised, have the courage to step back. Our squadron needs living pilots more than it needs dead heroes." The words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, and Campbell absorbed them carefully. Thought of the pressure building within the 94th Aero Squadron to prove American pilots could match the veterans of the French, British, and German air services. He thought of the subtle competition among pilots to accumulate victories, the way commanding officers pushed for more patrols, more aggressive tactics, more results. "I will remember," Campbell promised. "And I will try to help the younger pilots understand as well. We have many new men arriving from America, fresh from training, eager to prove themselves. They see the war as an adventure, a chance for glory. As we all did once," Bomar said softly. His eye had begun to droop, exhaustion overcoming him despite his obvious desire to continue the conversation. "Lieutenant Campbell, I must ask you for a favor. If I do not survive, and the doctors tell me this is quite possible, would you write to my family? It's not the official notification that they will receive, but a personal letter explaining how I fell. Tell them I fought well, that my opponent was skilled and honorable. Tell them I did not suffer unnecessarily." The request caught Campbell off guard, its intimacy and trust almost overwhelming. This was more than one pilot showing respect to another. This was a dying man asking for his story to be told truthfully, to spare his family the worst uncertainties. Campbell felt the weight of the responsibility settling on his shoulders. I will, he said firmly. I promise you, Lieutenant Boehmer, I will write to them. But you should also know that the doctors here are excellent. Major Andrews trained at Johns Hopkins before the war. If anyone can save you, it is the surgeons in this hospital. Boehmer's hand moved slightly on the bedsheet, and Campbell, understanding the gesture, grasped it carefully, mindful of the intravenous line. The German pilot's grip was weak but steady, a warrior's handshake exchanged in circumstances that would have seemed impossible just days ago. Thank you, Boehmer whispered, for visiting, for listening, for seeing me as a man rather than just an enemy. This war strips away our humanity, but men like you give me hope that something of what we were will survive. His eye closed fully now, his breathing settling into the shallow rhythm of exhausted sleep. Campbell released Boehmer's hand gently and stood, looking down at the wounded pilot for a long moment. The man who had been a faceless enemy, a target to be eliminated, had become something far more complicated, a fellow professional, a kindred spirit caught in the same terrible machinery of war, a human being deserving of respect and compassion. As Campbell turned to leave, Major Andrews entered the room, his medical bag in hand. The doctor glanced at the sleeping German, then at Campbell, his expression thoughtful. He spoke with you for quite a while, Andrews observed. More animation than we've seen since he arrived. Sometimes the best medicine isn't what comes in a bottle. Will he survive? Campbell asked quietly, knowing the question was unfair. No doctor could promise such things, but needing to ask nonetheless. Andrews set down his bag and checked Boehmer's pulse, his movements practiced and efficient. His injuries are severe, but he's strong, and he has something to live for that's clear from how he fought to stay conscious during your visit. I'd give him fair odds, better than even. But the next 48 hours will be critical. Head injuries are unpredictable. Campbell nodded, absorbing this information. He asked me to write to his family if he doesn't make it. To tell them how it happened? The doctor looked at Campbell with new respect. That's a heavy burden to place on the man who shot him down, but also a remarkable expression of trust. You've given him something important today. Lieutenant recognition of his dignity as a soldier and a man. That kind of respect between enemies is rare in this war. Campbell left the hospital with his mind in turmoil. The encounter with Boehmer, having stirred questions that went far beyond military protocol or tactical lessons, he returned to the aerodrome at Jingolt, where the 94th Aero Squadron was preparing for afternoon patrols, and found himself unable to shake the image of the wounded German pilot lying in that stark hospital room. His fellow pilots noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. Lieutenant James Meisner, one of Campbell's closest friends in the squadron, cornered him in the officers' mess tent. You're acting strange, Doug. Where did you disappear to this morning? Huffer was looking for you something about a reconnaissance patrol. Campbell hesitated, knowing that his visit to Boehmer would be difficult for some pilots to understand. The camaraderie among fighter pilots was strong, but it existed within strict boundaries of loyalty to one's own side. Visiting a downed enemy, especially one you had personally defeated, might be seen as eccentric at best, treasonous at worst. I went to see the German pilot I shot down, Campbell said simply, deciding that honesty was the only defensible approach. Lieutenant Paul Boehmer is at the field hospital in Toul. Meisner's eyebrows shot up. You visited him, the man you nearly killed? Why in God's name would you do that? 'Cause I could, Campbell replied. 'Cause he's a human being, a professional pilot like us. And because I wanted to understand what happened during our fight. I learned more in that hour than I have in months of combat debriefings. Word of Campbell's visit spread through the squadron like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. Some pilots, particularly those who had flown with the French or British and absorbed their more chivalrous traditions, understood and even admired Campbell's gesture. Others, especially recent arrivals who still viewed the war in simple terms of good versus evil, were bewildered or hostile. Captain Kenneth Marr, the squadron's intelligence officer, summoned Campbell to his office late that afternoon. Marr was a by-the-book regular Army officer who had been assigned to the air service despite having no personal interest in flying. He viewed the flyers under his jurisdiction with a mixture of respect for their courage and exasperation at their tendency to bend rules. Lieutenant Campbell, Marr began, his tone carefully neutral. I've received a report about your unauthorized visit to a German prisoner this morning. I need to understand your reasoning because I have to file a report with group headquarters. and they're going to want to know if you've been compromised in any way. Campbell had anticipated this conversation. He spent 20 minutes explaining his motivations, emphasizing the tactical lessons learned from speaking with an experienced enemy pilot, the intelligence value of understanding German training and tactics, and the diplomatic value of treating high-value prisoners with respect. He didn't mention the more personal philosophical aspects of the conversation. Those wouldn't register with Mar's military mindset. To Campbell's surprise, Mar was ultimately supportive. Between you and me, Campbell, I think you did the right thing. The old guard back in Washington doesn't always understand it. But this new kind of warfare aerial combat, the speed and isolation of ITT, creates different relationships between combatants. If you gain useful intelligence and maintained proper military bearing, I see no problem. He paused, allowing himself a slight smile. Besides, you're America's first ace. That gives you some leeway that other pilots don't have. The conversation gave Campbell permission to continue visiting Bomar, which he did over the following week whenever his flying schedule permitted. Each visit revealed new layers to the German pilot's character and experience. Bomar spoke of the evolution of aerial tactics from 1914 to 1918, describing the primitive early days when pilots fired at each other with pistols and rifles through the development of synchronized machine guns, to the sophisticated squadron-level tactics now employed by both sides. He described legendary pilots he had flown with or against Oswald Boelcke, Max Immelmann, Manfred von Richthofen. Bomar had joined the air service too late to fly with Boelcke before his death in 1916, but he had absorbed the great tactician's teachings through his disciples. The Dicta Boelcke, 8 fundamental rules of aerial combat, had shaped German fighter tactics and influenced every air service in the war. Campbell took notes during these conversations, with Bomar's permission, documenting insights that would prove valuable to American pilots throughout the remaining months of the war. He learned about the psychological preparation German aces underwent, the way they studied individual Allied pilots, learning their habits and tendencies to exploit weaknesses. He learned about aircraft maintenance practices, communication systems, and squadron organization. But beyond the tactical intelligence, something more profound was developing. Campbell and Bomar were forming a genuine friendship, transcending the artificial boundary of national enmity. They discovered shared interests. Both loved classical music. Both had studied technical subjects before the war. Both harbored doubts about the justifications for the massive slaughter unfolding across Europe. On April 23rd, 5 days after their first meeting, Campbell arrived at the hospital to find Bomar sitting up in bed, the bandages around his head reduced to a simple dressing over one eye. His color had improved dramatically, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery. Major Andrews told Campbell that Bomar had survived the critical period. Barring complications, he would live, though he would never fly combat missions again. The head injury had affected his vision and depth perception too severely. "So I am finished as a fighter pilot," Bomar said when Campbell shared the news. His tone was oddly neutral, neither relieved nor devastated. Perhaps that is justice. 43 victories, and then shot down by an American novice. He held up his hand before Campbell could protest. "I mean no insult. You flew well? But you were new to combat?" "Yes. First patrol season?" Campbell nodded. "Second month over the front? You were my 4th confirmed victory?" "And likely your most important, in terms of what you learned," Bomar observed. "Not about tactics. You knew those already. But about this." He gestured between them. "About maintaining humanity in the midst of organized inhumanity. Tell me, Lieutenant, how do your fellow pilots view your visits here?" Campbell described the mixed reactions within the squadron, the debates about proper conduct toward enemy prisoners, the tension between military necessity and human decency. Bomar listened intently, nodding occasionally. "It is the same in the German air service," he said when Campbell finished. "Some pilots celebrate every kill, keep tallies like hunters counting game. Others struggle with what we are asked to do. I have tried to maintain a middle path, executing my duty professionally, while remembering that my enemies are men like me, caught in circumstances beyond their control." As April gave way to May, Campbell's visits to Bomar became less frequent out of necessity. The German spring offensive had been blunted, but fighting along the Western Front intensified as Allied forces sought to capitalize on their advantage. The 94th Aero Squadron flew multiple patrols daily, And Campbell's responsibilities as one of the squadron's few experienced pilots left little time for hospital visits. But he continued to come when possible, and the conversations deepened. Boehmer began to share details about his family, a wife named Anna in Berlin, 2 young daughters he hadn't seen in 8 months, parents who ran a small manufacturing business in Bavaria. He showed Campbell a photograph that had survived the crash, creased and stained but still recognizable, a pretty dark-haired woman with 2 girls, perhaps 5 and 7 years old, standing in front of a modest house. "They think I am a hero," Boehmer said quietly, gazing at the photograph. "Anna writes me letters full of pride about my victories, about how the neighbors speak respectfully of the famous pilot. The girls draw pictures of airplanes and give them to their school teachers. They do not understand what it means, what I have done to earn these victories. How could they? I barely understand it myself." Campbell thought of his own family back in Michigan, his mother's letters that mixed pride with barely concealed fear, his father's stoic encouragement to do his duty. They saw the war through newspapers and official pronouncements, sanitized versions of the carnage that bore little resemblance to reality. The gap between what civilians believed about the war and what soldiers experienced was vast and perhaps unbridgeable. "When you write to them," Campbell asked, "do you tell them the truth about what combat is really like?" Boehmer shook his head. "What purpose would that serve? To burden them with nightmares they can do nothing about? No. I write about the beauty of flying, about the camaraderie of my squadron mates, about the technical details of aircraft that bore them, but reassure them I am occupied with mechanical concerns rather than mortal danger, to protect them from the truth." The conversation turned to the future, a subject both men approached with uncertainty. Germany's position was deteriorating. Even Boehmer acknowledged this. The American entry into the war had tipped the balance decisively against the Central Powers. It was no longer a question of whether Germany would lose, but when and at what cost. "What will you do when the war ends?" Campbell asked. "Return to engineering?" Boehmer was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I do not know if there will be a place for men like me in the world that comes after this war. We have become specialists in destruction, experts at killing. How does one translate that into peacetime pursuits? I think about designing aircraft, but every time I imagine it, I see not passenger planes or cargo haulers, but fighters. My mind has been shaped by war, and I wonder if it can be reshaped for peace." The existential weight of the question hung between them. Campbell had his own doubts about returning to architecture, about whether he could sit at a drafting table designing houses after spending months hunting men through the clouds. The war changed everyone it touched. But perhaps it changed pilots most of all, men who had tasted the ultimate freedom and the ultimate violence, who had learned to make life-and-death decisions in fractions of seconds. "Perhaps we can help each other," Campbell suggested. "After the war, I mean. If you design aircraft and I design buildings, maybe we can collaborate on airfields, hangars, facilities that serve aviation without serving war. Turn our experience toward constructive purposes." Boehmer smiled, though sadness lingered in his eyes. "A beautiful thought, Lieutenant. I hope the world will allow such things. But I fear the hatred this war has generated will not dissipate quickly. Former enemies working together, it may be decades before such cooperation is possible." On May 7th, Campbell received orders transferring him temporarily to Paris for a series of meetings with French aviation officials. Before leaving, he visited Boehmer one final time. The German pilot was now able to walk with assistance, his physical recovery progressing remarkably well, even as his flying career was definitively over. They stood together at the hospital's courtyard, watching the sky where other men continued the deadly work they had both left behind. "I will be transferred to a prisoner of war camp soon," Boehmer told Campbell. "Somewhere in France, far from the front. I will sit out the remainder of the war behind wire, and perhaps that is appropriate. My war ended when you shot me down, Lieutenant Campbell. In a strange way, you may have saved my life. A few more weeks of flying in my exhausted state, and someone else would have killed me permanently." Campbell felt the truth of this observation. Boehmer had been operating at his limit, driven by pride and duty to continue flying when he should have rested. The crash, terrible as it was, had removed him from a situation that was statistically certain to kill him eventually. Fighter pilots who survived 3 years of combat were extraordinarily rare. Amr had been living on borrowed time. "I have written a letter for you," Boehmer continued, reaching into his jacket pocket and producing a sealed envelope. It is addressed to my wife, telling her about you, about your visits, about what happened during our final fight. I want her to know that I was treated with respect, that my opponent was honorable. Circumstances allow, after the war, perhaps you could deliver it personally. I would like Anna and my daughters to meet the man who defeated me, to understand that not all enemies are monsters. Campbell accepted the letter carefully, understanding the profound trust it represented. I will deliver it, he promised. When the war ends, whenever that may be, I will find your family and give them this letter personally. Have my word. They shook hands then, firmly. Two warriors acknowledging the bond forged between them through combat and its aftermath. Campbell left the hospital knowing he might never see Bomer again. Prisoner transfers were unpredictable. The chaos of war separated people as arbitrarily as it brought them together. But he carried the letter safely in his personal effects, a tangible reminder of a profound encounter. The meetings in Paris lasted 2 weeks. Campbell briefed French aviation officials on American training methods, discussed tactical developments observed during recent patrols, and attended formal dinners where senior officers toasted the growing effectiveness of American air power. It was tedious but necessary work, the bureaucratic machinery that supported combat operations,